Good evening. Welcome to the fourth lecture in our Communications in the 21st Century. And it's my privilege to welcome tonight's speaker, Evan Thomas. Evan is the Princeton University inaugural Ferris Professor of Journalism. He is lecturer in the Council of the Humanities, author, historian, and journalist. Evan was made Newsweek's editor in September of 2006. He was the magazine's lead writer on major news stories, more than 100 cover stories on national and international news, and the author of many longer features, including Newsweek's special behind the scenes on presidential elections. Earlier this year, after nearly 25 years, Evan decided to leave Newsweek to teach and to continue writing. He has written 7 nonfiction books, including the New York Times bestseller, John Paul Jones, and he's currently at work on a book about Eisenhower. While Evan is a graduate of Harvard and the University of Virginia Law School, many of you will know that his grandfather, Norman Thomas, was a Princeton graduate and a 6-time presidential candidate. Please welcome Evan Thomas.
Thanks, Pam. Can you hear me? That's the first test. Everybody hear me up there? Okay. I'm going to talk about, as advertised, about how we can reinvigorate the press a little bit, which needs some reinvigorating, but I'm going to take a bit of a circle route to get there, because I think that the context here is as important as what we need to do. And I want to start out, actually, in Germany, in Berlin. I was there in the spring of 2009, and I went to the German National History Museum, big, beautiful edifice there. And I intended to go for an hour or two, and I ended up spending 2 days there. And the reason why was because I was absolutely fixated by the story it told. It's organized chronologically from the time of the Romans till roughly through the Cold War. And it's like, I was searching for an analogy. It's like being on this big, beautiful ship with full sails that has no keel. Germany just rolled over again and again and again. It had all this wonderful culture and all these great thinkers and this great music and great leaders, and it was just one chaotic disaster after another. It just seemed, and it's very poignant walking through those halls because it's so beautifully done. And then, you know, you'll be some flowering moment in German history, and then wham, over it will go. Well, I felt a little smug about all this coming from the United States because it's always been a kind of an article of faith for me that really it can't happen here. That there's a kind of innate stability. The pendulum swings wildly. That's true. But that it always swings back. And at least since the Civil War, an important exception, things have been pretty stable for a couple of reasons. One is our Constitution, that once we got rid of the sin of slavery, provided us with a system of checks and balances that really serves as this wonderful stabilizing device. And the other factor, I think, is social mobility, that this country has been extraordinarily fluid in its social structure. You may all recall in, I think it was 1988, a Yale professor named Paul Kennedy wrote a book on the decline of empires that got everybody's attention because it seemed to forecast a grim end for the United States, that we would follow in the path of Rome and Spain and Great Britain as a suffer from imperial overstretch. I never believed that for an important reason, that all those empires that went down had no social mobility. And usually the crowning moment was when the upper classes looted the treasury in an effort to preserve their own power. Whereas in this country, we've had a history of extraordinary social mobility. So I was never really that worried about it. In fact, at the time, I wrote a piece about this in Newsweek saying it just didn't bother me. Now, it's true that America has always had a paranoid streak. I mean, every college freshman, reads about the paranoid streak in American life. We've always had demagogues, Joe McCarthy and in the lifetimes of many of you, Huey Long. There's an angry, resentful, paranoid streak in American politics, and it can produce some pretty scary people. But here's the thing. I have a rule, what I call the 51% rule, which is that it's very hard for demagogues to get to 51% in this country. In fact, it's never happened. Even sort of noble populists like William Jennings Bryan just can't get from here to there, that there's a self-correcting device almost, because the manipulations and the lies of demagogues get exposed in this country. Sooner or later, the truth outs. And they can get pretty far, and they can scare a lot of people, and they can manipulate them, but sooner or later, the truth comes along to take them out. And this has always been an article of faith for me. I'm not so sure anymore. I've been thinking about this a lot, and I want to I want to walk you through this, where my doubts come from, and I'm going to get to the press eventually, but it takes a little bit of, I'm going to ask you to sort of take my hand and walk down the path here. I don't think that the boogeyman is Sarah Palin. I don't think that she can get elected. I still don't think that. But I think that somebody more clever may come along, somebody who's even better at manipulations, who's a little bit more credible. That's really what I fear, sort of the next generation Sarah Palin. And I do for a number of reasons. One, I live in Washington, and I've worked there for many years, and the polarization there is really shocking. It really is. I used to cover Congress in 1981, and Democrats and Republicans used to fight, but then they would go out drinking together. I always loved the fact that in the 1960s, the Secretary of the Senate, Bobby Baker, ran a whorehouse in Capitol Hill called the Carroll Arms. It was a bipartisan whorehouse. Now, that's long gone, and I had a vivid example of this recently. I had lunch with a senator named John Barrasso, who is a conservative, moderate to conservative, Wyoming senator, orthopedic surgeon. And after lunch, we went to this place called the Dirksen Room, which is the private dining room of U.S. senators, no staff. And it's supposed to be the place where they can go and break bread and get to know each other. And this was on a Wednesday, Senate's in session, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. We open up the door, tablecloths, table set, beautiful room, soup, steaming, salad there. Nobody's there. Oh, it's empty. I said, well, where is everybody? He says, well, they're off raising money, or they're off at their caucus, but they never go there anymore. And the sort of ugly truth is that the senators of the different parties don't even know each other. Little things make a big difference. Trent Lott once told Barrasso, Trent Lott, the former senator from Mississippi and Republican leader, once told Barrasso that the bad moment for the U.S. Senate came when they agreed to pay for senators to go back home every weekend. They used to be once a month. Once it could be every weekend, people started keeping their families back home, and so they went home every weekend. And they weren't going to each other's kids' soccer games, and much less Bobby Baker's whorehouse. They just weren't seeing each other, and so they weren't getting to know each other. And that has contributed to this deep polarization, fed by other things, particularly cable TV. But the fact is, the parties don't get along, and when that happens, people just stop. Not only do they not sort of agree with each other, they don't even hear each other anymore. They don't even speak the same language. There's just a complete dissonance. So that is not a good sign right there. The other thing that's happening in the country is that the gap between rich and poor is doing that, and really not just kind of incremental ways, but serious ways. There are a couple of statistics that have come out recently. One is that in 1970, The top 1% of the country in terms of income took 9% of the wealth. Now that's up to 29%. That's a big jump. Other statistics that you've heard, in 1970, the CEO's salary was an average of about 50 times the average worker. Now it's 500 times. And almost all the growth, the economic growth, has been at that high end lately. So you have, it's not that the poor are getting much poorer, although you can debate about this, maybe a little tiny bit poor, but the rich are definitely getting much richer, and that gap is a very unhealthy thing. And there are signs that social mobility is actually freezing in the United States. I've read in The Economist, a fairly conservative magazine, that Europe has more social mobility than the United States, which is kind of a surprise to think about that. That's, to me, a very dangerous sign. And all this anti-immigration fever, I think, is dangerous. And we actually did close the door. Immigration has been America's greater strength. I know there are terrible problems, especially if you're living in places like Arizona, but it would be a mistake for us, I think, just to shut down our immigration. So there are these large things happening that add to the anger and the resentment and the separation in American society, all sort of kindling or fuel for demagogues and the politics of fear. Now, the other thing that's really fed this, I'm sorry to say, is what's happened to the press. At one level, this has been true, particularly in the internet age, and there's something paradoxical about this or ironic about it. You would think that the internet would serve truth because, something I've always believed, the more sources of information you have, the more voices, the greater the marketplace of ideas, the more truth will be served, the more truth will be outed simply by openness, freedom. That should be a goad to producing truth. But it doesn't quite seem to be working that way. Now, this is still early days, but there are these kind of ominous signs, and I point to a few of them. One is this persistent statistic that, 13% of the American people think that Barack Obama is a foreigner, and whatever it is, 12% think he's a Muslim. These very persistent untruths that adhere no matter what people say. And the problem is that information is so unmediated now that instead of getting it from news organizations that for all their failings made some attempts to find out what the truth is, you're more apt to get an email from your cousin saying this must be true. And where do they get that? Well, any number of sources. My favorite, the most recent one that sort of illustrates this point is that Drudge, the infamous Drudge, picked up in some Indian newspaper that Obama's trip to India cost $1 billion. Just complete fiction. But, the talk show guys, Limbaugh and all that, they picked up on it, and they don't care. The truth, they don't care about the truth. And they started stirring about it. And then pretty soon Congress people started picking up on it. And the next thing you know, NBC has got to do a fact-checking thing on the nightly news to try to rebut this, which was great, except that a lot of people out there think that NBC is a big liberal conspiracy to distort the truth. So the point is that these untruths adhere in a way that's very uncomfortable making. People choose to believe certain things. They only go to their confirming sources. They want to have their opinions confirmed, and they really don't want to hear. And after a while, they just don't believe what the other side said. This is all real fuel for demagogic manipulation. Again, this is early days, but it's got me thinking, and it really gives me pause, and it's what's shaking me here. Now, this is not just a function of the internet, and now I want to try to go a little deeper here, and get into what I think really the deeper and more complex causes are, but ultimately what the solution is. It's always been, I remember being raised, taking American history in 8th grade in the 1950s, and it's just such an article of faith that man is rational. I mean, the old Enlightenment idea that man is, that reason prevails and man is rational and therefore should be allowed to govern himself. I remember thinking that was just rote. I remember in high school, Hobbes was wrong that we're all dirty and brutish and life is short, and Locke was right that man can govern himself. And that was just, it became a kind of an article of faith, and was for many years. Certainly in the, if you go back to the progressive era, there's this belief that man is rational and that science can solve problems, and that if we just apply our reason, things will work out, and there is sort of a reasonable man standard in the law, and there's this great faith in reason and in institutions that if you just put enough smart people, enough Princeton professors in a room, they're going to figure out the answer. Even Harvard professors sometimes can figure it out. And that was kind of an article of faith, certainly among the elites. Then came the 1960s. And things got knocked into a cocked hat for a lot of reasons. A lot of unreason was kind of loosed in the land. And it took there were different sort of repercussions or fallout. One was in the academy, where this kind of faith in institutions was really shaken. A lot of these 60s kids are now professors today, and some of you are familiar with the tropes of academia of really the last 20 or 30 years of deconstruction, and this idea that there is no reality. There's no such thing as reality. There are different people's different perceptions of reality, and everybody's perception is roughly equal, but there is no such thing as truth, really. There are merely perceptions of truth, and in a world like that, what really matters is power, more than anything else. But there is no truth. And I notice that in undergraduates, this has become fairly ingrained, fairly deeply believed that it's all relative. They use words like agency, but they don't. The idea of truth and beauty is it's out there, but it is a lesser value or a less embraced value, because the academy has really pretty well embraced these kind of deconstructionist values. Now, maybe that's just the academy, but it's much deeper than that. I mean, faith in institutions generally in the land is pretty low and going down. I mean, there's a lot of cynicism there. And actually, I like to make fun of deconstruction and all that, but there's a lot of good research to show that actually we're not all that rational. A lot of neuroscience today, I'm no neuroscientist, but what I read in the paper is that where neuroscience is going is that they're looking more and more at the emotions. And you can see this in all sorts of fields starting to take place. Take economics. The idea that in economics it's such an article of faith that people will make rational choices and that the marketplace will work. Well, currently economics, as far as I can tell, behavioral economics is pretty big now. People are looking at unreason, at animal spirits, especially when you've had these bubbles, when things go up and then they come crashing down, and there's so much unreason in the marketplace. The economists are starting to look more and more at this idea that actually it's not driven by reason or rational man standards, but it's driven more by unreasoning emotions. And that sounds right to me. Now, at some level, there's nothing new about this. One of my favorite book about the Founding Fathers is a book called Passionate Sage by Joseph Ellis, which is a book about John Adams. And John Adams' genius as a founder was his self-awareness. Because John Adams himself was irrational and vainglorious and full of conceits and jealousies and emotions, he recognized that in himself and in others. And that was the beginning of his wisdom that led him to the idea of checks and balances and the separation of powers. So much of his constitutional theory comes from his own sense of self-limitation, his own recognition, self-awareness about the power of unreason, particularly among ruling elites that need to check themselves. So in a way, there's nothing new about this. It's been these notions of the need for checks and balances have been around for a long time to check our animal spirits. But it has taken on a new life based in science and neuroscience, and it is where things are going. Now, how can this actually help us here? Well, a couple of things. One is that I do think that the idea of a free press is right. I mean, Jefferson famously said that he'd rather have freedom of the press than anything else, because he saw that as a check on power. And I do believe that the press can be a check on power, but it has to function as a check on power. It can't be so easily manipulated as is now the case, certainly in cable TV and many precincts of the press. The old mainstream press, which has become weakened, financially weakened, and is sort of back on its heels right now, needs to adjust to this current reality. And I think the way to do this is, again, paradoxically, and I think this through emotion. Now, what do I mean by that? There was something, I just read a book by a guy named Jack Fuller, who was the editor of the Chicago Tribune. And he's written a book about the press where he talks about the old, for a long time the standard was something called the standard model of professional journalism. And what that meant was to be dispassionate and objective and nonpartisan, and this whole idea that of journalistic detachment and objectivity, so enshrined in the business when I got there. There's a lot to be said for it, but it's a little bit misleading because I don't think people ever really are as objective as we claim to be. So it had a bit of a hollowness always to it. And frankly, it's boring. It's boring. People would, plow through it when there was no other choice, but now they have a lot of choices. They don't have to read just the good gray lady, the New York Times, which has actually gotten pretty clever about getting more readable. But the old model cannot survive in a world where people have so many choices, there's so much fun stuff to read, there's so much salacious stuff to read. The press has got to get with the program here, and I know this sounds counterintuitive, but I think that high-end journalism has to learn how to write and to project itself and to convey information in a more lively and emotional way. And I find this actually in my own class, that I'm teaching here. I come in with this sort of bias against using the first person. At Newsweek, I wrote for news magazines for 33 years before I ever used the pronoun I, because that was just forbidden. Now, there was a sort of a phony premise. Even though I was never using the pronoun I was writing with this kind of Olympian, Jovian, I don't know if you've ever, the news magazines were written in this fly on the wall, but it's a pretty imperial fly on the wall, sort of telling you what you ought to believe. But never I. It was always the voice of Time or the voice of Newsweek. There was something a little bit dishonest about that. And I remember I was writing a piece about John McCain in 2008, and my editor, John Meacham, just took my copy and wrote in not what I was pretending that Newsweek thought about John McCain, but what I thought about John McCain. Now, that's subjective and all that, but it was also more honest. And I find with my students in class, they increasingly want to use the pronoun I. Now, you can make fun of it as being egotistical and self-centered, and a lot of students are. But there's also an honesty to it. And a lot of sort of modern media thinkers have disparaged old-fashioned objectivity, as one calls it. It's the view from nowhere, that it doesn't mean anything, or it's actually covering up subjectivity. So I think actually as journalism goes forward, we have to learn how to write in more subjective ways, using the first person I, but do it in a responsible way. We can't just cede all that territory to the bloggers, to the guys in underwear in their basements just kind of writing away. That mainstream journalism has got to get more entertaining, appeal more to the emotion, use the pronoun I, not be stuck in 1932 pretending that we're the standard model of professional journalism, because it doesn't work. People don't want to read it. It's boring, and it was a bit of a fraud anyways. So I think that we have to find clever ways, and I'm counting on my students to do this. I'm too old to figure this out. But my students, I think, can. And I look at their tastes and their interests. Jon Stewart is such an interesting example. A comic who actually is a very effective check on power. He, by ridiculing things and by using irony and snarkiness, and, it makes me uncomfortable because we don't like it. Newsweek, we used to try to take snarkiness out of stories. But what the hell? He's a very powerful figure, and he's a good check on power. And, he's useful. And I think this younger generation has to find ways to be creative in that way to get people's attention and try to be, purveyors of truth, but recognizing that we are not just rational beings, but emotional beings, and, be honest about that and try to find ways to marry the best of the old values of journalism is seeking truth with some of the realities of what we know about who we are and how we operate. And we have to do it in this kind of wide-open, gunslinging internet in order to win our readers back and to find a way to reach readers. I just think that we have to do it. I think this is all early days. I think it's all being worked out. I will say, I'm giving you a somewhat apocalyptic speech here, but I will end with a couple of notes. One is, I just finished a book about Theodore Roosevelt and the Spanish-American War, and I was fascinated that Roosevelt and his buddy Henry Cabot Lodge and their friend Owen Wister, you could not be in a more secure American aristocracy than those three in the 1890s. That's about as rooted in sort of old money, old family security as you can imagine. And yet they had lunch in New York in the summer of 1896, and they made a bet on how long the American Republic would last. And the outside bet was 50 years. So even in a very seemingly secure time for a very secure group, they feared that the end was nigh and that they had only maybe 2 generations to go. So you can be too apocalyptic about these things. I have to say, I deep down still have great faith in American resilience, and I do think we have been an exceptional country, and I think we still are, certainly compared to all the others. And so we're not Germany. We really aren't, and I don't think we're going to become that. But we got to keep our eyes open, and we have to be resilient. And we have to, in my world, the press has to change and to evolve and to be flexible and to be supple and with that same kind of resilience that has made the country great. My last thought is I was thinking about this today, and Pat Moynihan has a wonderful quote, which is that everybody is entitled to their own opinions, but not their own facts. That's worth remembering. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions about anything. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things I see is like Rupert Murdoch. Now, he controlled a lot of the press for a while.
Yeah.
Now, how do you overcome him? Because he's in mainstream media.
He's brilliant. He's brilliant. He's who's the most brilliant weapon he has is a guy named Roger Ailes. How many of you know who Roger Ailes is? Well, Roger Ailes is a fascinating figure, and I think in some ways a dangerous one. The detail about him, I recall, I just can't get out of my mind, was he cut his teeth with Richard Nixon in 1968, learning how to get working class Democrats to vote Republican. And he did it by scaring them, and specifically scaring him about race. And Nixon, of course, wasn't going to be racist himself. I'm not sure Nixon was racist. Nixon was just a politician. But they knew, these guys knew that if we're going to win in 1968, we've got to scare people, and there have been riots in the cities. And so Roger Ailes went out to find a New York taxi cab driver who was willing to go on camera and be racist. Because Nixon couldn't do it, and Roger Ailes wasn't going to do it. So they found some poor working stiff, some taxi cab driver, to make racist comments. There's young Roger Ailes learning how to manipulate things at a young age, and he's been doing it one way or another ever since. Not necessarily on race, but he just knows how to play the fear card. He really, in a very subtle, clever, I think cynical way, I'm not sure, it's hard to really read people's hearts and minds, but boy, he's good at it. And that Fox News, they know how to play this card, and they've been playing it brilliantly. And they've got the old mainstream media back on our heels. We're also scared of Roger Ailes and Fox, that the press has gotten a little timid. Part of our failure to play fact checker and truth asserter is because we're afraid that if we go after Ailes and Murdoch and all those guys, we'll be accused, you liberals, and we don't want to be called liberals. Oh, God, don't do that. Don't call us a liberal. And so the mainstream press is on its heels, and they're not doing a great job as a truth squad on the Murdoch press, broadly defined. What was it? There's some phrase that, I forget now. But anyways, the truth is Fox News has some standards, and they're certainly clever, but the next layer over, the radio guys, Limbaugh, all that, they don't have any standards at all. They just make it up. And they have a power, and that's what I fear, is that detached from truthfulness, that untruthy group will take on enough momentum so they will not be just an extremist or fringe thing, but they will become the majority. And that's I fear a demagogue coming along to manipulate them. Now, if Ailes was sitting here, he'd be steaming, of course, and say I was all wrong on about 8 million. And he's such a clever guy, he'd probably be able to, find good ways to rebut it. But that's my impression of how he operates. And I take him serious as a foe. As I was saying, I think we're almost too scared of him because he is so formidable. He's created this, and they made a ton of money. He's made a lot of money from Murdoch, while the rest of us have been losing money hand over fist. Ailes, I guess Ailes would say sour grapes on our part, but he's figured out how to make money. Yeah.
How does it happen? President Hill was able to trust us in the time that he did.
Yeah.
What were the circumstances that allowed him to get enough power to force these things out?
Yeah. Well, one is he was a very clever politician. He was a trust buster, but he wasn't wild and crazy about it. He did it. He struck a lot of compromises. He was not the cutting edge, but he was the guy who actually got a lot of it done because he was willing to compromise. He was, for all of his bluster and bully and all that Rooseveltian charging up San Juan Hill, all of that, certainly had all that. He was a shrewd pol, and he did know when to compromise. And he caught the right moment. The malefactors of wealth had overplayed their hand, and there was all this unease in the country, and Roosevelt struck the moment by making deals with a lot of different sides and sort of picking up this progressive spirit. It was in retrospect, I have sort of a rosy glow over it, with this early progressive period where they did have faith in reason, misplaced maybe, but they did have faith in reason. And they thought that government could do good, and that it needed to interfere with the marketplace at least a little bit to protect individual rights, actually to protect the individual from monopolization. Also, Roosevelt was very good at using the press. He complained about the muckrakers. In fact, he coined the term muckraker. But he was pretty good at working reporters himself. And he was just a very effective chief executive. If you read Edmund Morris's book, Theodore Rex, he's not just a great moral force, he's a clever pol. Yeah.
You were the demagogue, and I remember in 2009, everybody was making fun of the Tea Party and how it evolved. From your point of view, where do you see a demagogue coming from? What party, what side, and what type might that individual be? Not get the rest, but something much more clever and sophisticated?
Well, I can imagine some scenarios. One is that one is national security and one is economic. National security scenarios, we get attacked in a serious way, and some demagogue comes in and says, well, we just can't have civil liberties anymore. The enemy's everywhere, and so goodbye Bill of Rights. And a lot of people would vote after a really serious terrorist attack, a dirty bomb or a nuke, certainly. A lot of people would vote to suspend that portion of the Constitution that guarantees civil liberties. I mean, we damn near did it after 9/11. We sort of did it in a de facto way. So I think a good demagogue could make that happen. The economic scenario is that unless we step up to our debt problems, we are going to have a lower standard of living in this country for sure, and we're probably going to have some economic shocks. Our democracy, our prosperity, and our ability to get along with each other has been funded and flowered because of a rising tide. Economic prosperity is good for people getting along. Economic downturns have the opposite effect. They pit classes against each other. They pit people against each other. And if things really go south, if you have some, say, big bond crisis where all of a sudden, we can't finance our debt anymore and interest rates are shooting through the roof and, or the Fed is trying to inflate our way out of the debt, some crisis probably provoked by something abroad, and all of a sudden we're in a depression or hyperinflation, all of those are profoundly destabilizing politically. And that's the moment when the demagogue can come forth. And, there are lots of examples in other countries, Peronist stuff in South America where they freeze prices and help the workers, or there are lots of ways to imagine this. And these are all those things that happen in other countries. They happen in other countries with great regularity, routinely. Strong men, the man on the white horse who comes in to restore order, but you get to give up your rights, but that always just seems so foreign. That's other countries go through that. We don't, and I still think that's true. But I'm here to say I'm a little more worried than I was a couple of years ago.
You think that personality would be like faux cowboy, like the
Sure, yeah, it would be a swaggering, macho, tough guy, order and security, man on a horse. Yeah, it would be a cowboy thing. I mean, Bush gave sort of a bad name to cowboys, cowboyism. In Princeton, New Jersey, he did, but in parts of the country, there's a guy, the governor of Texas guy, Rick Perry, his name is. He's a real cowboy character, and he wants to sort of abolish the federal government, as far as I can tell. He's a pretty shrewd. He's not a demagogue, but he's playing some of those organ notes. And now again, I hear myself being apocalyptic about this. I'm not apocalyptic. I'm worried. I put it this way: assumptions that I had that it could never happen here have been shaken. Yeah. Well, there's a lot in common. I mean, Hearst and Roger Ailes had a lot in common, and they both knew how to play on popular fear and desires. Hearst used to call his brand of journalism crime and underwear journalism. And it was a great way of getting audiences. But of course, what really sold papers was war. So Hearst claimed to have started the Spanish-American War. He didn't. But he sure did his best to start it, and lied like crazy. I mean, he was way out there. And, but Hearst failed as a politician. He tried to run for office and never made it. He was elected a congressman but failed as mayor of New York, ran for president, ran for the Senate, yeah. He had a number of political runs in the 1900s, and they all fizzled because he couldn't quite bring it off. Ailes is not running for office, but they're playing in the same. It's this nothing subtle about it. It's playing on people's fears instead of their hopes. You find out what people are afraid of, and you look for an enemy, an other. The other can be abroad. It can be Soviet communism. It can be radical Islam, something scary out there, or it can be at home. That's what Roger Ailes was looking at in 1968 after all those riots. It was student radicals, angry black people. Silent majority is built on fear of those folks. They are electing somebody on a law and order platform. That's what Nixon was running on, law and order, to restore law and order in the face of dangerous radicalism. It's an old formula, but my fear is it could be played if things get unstable here. Somebody's going to come sailing in to play that card to promise to a majority of Americans that he or she will restore order. But they're doing it by abrogating the Constitution. Yeah. 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 No. No. The problem is political will. Yeah. Well, I wrote about this in Newsweek. I urge you all to go. I have a story in Newsweek this week saying Obama needs to get brave. And it's not that complicated, but it's politically very difficult. You got to say, hey, folks, here's the truth. Here's the truth. And this is not a conjectural thing. This is not just a few economists, working on their blackboards. This is pretty much every economist except for Paul Krugman believes this. That if we don't get control of our deficits, not right away. Yes, we have to stimulate right now, but very quickly got to start dealing with it because of an aging population. I think the number is in 1990 we had 5 workers for every retiree, and we're heading in by 2030 we'll have 2 workers for every retiree. It's just the baby boom. And so if you look at those charts of what happens to Medicare, which grows at roughly twice the rate of inflation, it's pretty soon it's eating up the entire federal budget. There's no money left for anything else. So everybody who looks at this agrees you got to do 2 things. You got to raise taxes and you got to cut spending. If you just try to raise taxes, you'll kill the economy. If you just try to cut spending, the cuts will be so great that you really will be throwing Granny in the snow, as all the demagogues suggest. You have to do both, I would guess, in roughly equal measure, at least as a starting point. But no politician will say that because they're frozen by their fear of the past. You know, Walter Mondale in 1984 wanted to raise taxes, and look what happened to him. He lost 49 states. You know, Jimmy Carter put on a sweater, and look what happened to him. You know, I mean, these political consultants have these very long memories of these terrible things that happen to you if you suggest this. So I say in the piece, I have never met a political consultant who thinks it's a good idea to tell their client, as they call them, the elected representative that they work for, that they should call for raising taxes and cutting spending. But everybody who looks at it agrees that they should do it. So my take is that Barack Obama is sort of drifting downward, vaguely irrelevant. He's doing okay in the polls, but not too well. And there's just kind of, he's sort of peevish and just not really a player, really. At this kind of stagnant moment, he should say, he should do the one thing he does. He's not a good glad-hander. He's not going to shake hands or be warm. He's not Bill Clinton. He's not going to convince anybody. He's good at one thing. He's smart, and he's capable of being intellectually honest. And he should do what he did in the race speech, was tell the truth. That speech actually secured him, politically successful. It secured him the nomination. You may recall in April 2008, Hillary was coming on a little bit, playing some of these populist cards, actually trying to scare poor whites in the South. And Reverend Wright pops up, and all of a sudden, Obama's got a problem here, and his aides are going, don't say anything about it. You're a black guy running for president. Do not say anything about it. Just pretend it doesn't exist. Obama defied all of his aides, all of his advisors. He wrote his own speech. It was the best speech he ever gave because he told the truth. And it worked. Politically, it worked. That was the end of the Hillary challenge, and because people admired and respected him for that. I believe he could do the same, give an honest speech about what the stakes are. And as you say, it's not all that hard. If we deal with it now, and we do it in sort of a common sense way, it can be done without terribly inconveniencing or, tax rates might have to rise up to where they were, say, in the 1970s or, even in the 1990s when the economy was doing fine. The rich could stand to pay a little bit more without, giving up too many summer homes. It can be done, but somebody's got to say it, and he's got to say it. And so, lastly, I would say he should run for re-election on it. Now, political consultants, I can hear them going, "Are you crazy?" I think the only way you get this done is if there's a national mandate, because Congress is not going to do it. You have to vote. You have to have the American people specifically vote for a president who says, "I'm going to do this." He has to run, or she has to run on that. And then, if you get a national mandate, if that is vote for me, and you are voting to do this, then it has a chance, and only then does it have a chance of passing Congress. So I think that should be Obama's re-election strategy. I assure you, everybody I've ever met in Washington thinks I'm completely nuts. Yeah.
Historically speaking, when you look at politics the last 50 years, I don't know that much, but I'm just thinking that in the recent 10 years, some of the slander from newspapers saying how Donald McConnell saying that the only time that we're going to get anything done is if that president's out of office. Has it been a lot louder? Is it a lot nastier?
No. Go back to the Founding Fathers. I love this. They were sliming each other right and left. My all-time favorite, is that Thomas Jefferson, the great hero of free speech, hires a journalist to smear John Adams. Thomas Jefferson hires a journalist named Collender to smear John Adams, which he does in his papers. Then Collender decides that Jefferson's not paying him enough, so he turns on Jefferson, and that is the origin of the Sally Hemings story. Collender is the guy who puts out that Jefferson was sleeping with a slave, and it was actually a smear that happened to be true, I guess. And so it really tested Jefferson's faith in free speech. So that was the level of discourse in 18. That's why we have the Alien and Sedition Acts then. So people have been sliming each other for a long time. It's sort of politics of, and the press for a long time was like, this notion of the objective press, that's really a 20th century thing. In the 19th century, the press was bloggers on steroids. All these pamphleteers, partisan pamphleteers, banging away at each other angrily and with all sorts of, spreading sexual rumors. Ma, ma, where's your pa? Gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha. So it was, political vituperation is nothing new. The larger issue is how do you check it? How do you truth? Where's the truth, and how do you counter that kind of speech? That speech is always going to be with us. Yeah, up there. Yeah, well, I'm uncomfortable with this because I've been trained to do the opposite. And in fact, I was part of a campaign at Newsweek to take snark out of stories in the early 90s. But my students persuade me that, the old formulas just don't work. And you have to find ways to educate while entertaining. In a sense, it's not new. I mean, Henry Luce's idea of the news magazine was pretty simple. It was, if you want to get people to understand about trade or, say, the auto company, you have to put a face on the cover of Time. Because people will read about a person when they won't read about an issue. And so if you put Henry Ford's face on the cover of Time, you get them into the tent that way. Then you teach them about the auto industry. So it's this idea of get them into the tent with a little bit, showing a little leg or a little entertainment or whatever, is an old formula. Newsweek, we used to always, as often as possible, on the covers of Newsweek, get the word either sex or secret. In order to get people in. Now, we rationalized it because we were doing that to, it was actually a fairly sober magazine, but we were trying to bait the hook by getting people in. We're going to have to find ways to do that without overdoing it. And there's an interesting experiment that's going to happen in my old magazine, Newsweek, because we're in terrible shape, our economics model's broken, and now the new editor is going to be Tina Brown. Most of you know who she is. She made her name with Vanity Fair and then the New Yorker, and she runs something called the Daily Beast now. And her formula is what she calls high-low, which is you give people some raunch and some gossip and some sex low, but you also give them high. And it's if you look at Vanity Fair, it's a classic model of high-low. There may be more low some months than high, but there's some high in there too. And so that you got to give people a pretty big buffet table of choices, but there got to be some sweets there. Now, what's happened now is that they're so easily distorted. Here's the kind of thing you have to fight against. If you look at the daily menu of what drives Washington, it's this incessant cable fighting over petty issues. But the funny thing is that the table is set early in the morning by fairly responsible, smart journalists. Mike Allen of Politico, on his playbook, which is this guy who never sleeps, puts out a sort of a menu of here's what's coming up today, and the White House tries to feed it. Mike gets up at 3, never goes to bed. The White House gets up at 4 and feeds them. And Playbook is a perfectly reasonable, intelligent kind of menu. And then the other sort of Washington starter menu is Morning Joe. Now, Morning Joe has very intelligent people on it on a regular basis, sort of smart, chattering class types. And so you would think that's a pretty reasonable start to the day. But then a funny thing happens. Cable kicks in. And what happens is in places like Morning Joe, they'll put out a smorgasbord that will have some healthy dishes, say the deficit reform, this commission that came out last week. They'll talk about Simpson, Erskine Bowles' suggestions. And they'll also want to have a few tasty, salty treats, like is Hillary Clinton going to knock off Joe Biden? But by the time it gets into the cable sphere by about 9 a.m., they've forgotten all about Bowles and deficit reform and all that. They're into, is Hillary going to knock off Biden? So what happens is that cable grabs for the dessert and the sweets and the French fries, and that's what gets sort of all day long, drives the conversation. And the White House is busily kind of trying to ignore it. But Biden's own national security advisor, Tony Blinken, once said to me, we're in the White House and the president says, ignore all this cable TV nonsense. And we have our TV sets on all day watching them so we'll know what to ignore. And that's kind of literally true. They get sucked in by it. And it's very distracting. And So that's an example where high-low doesn't really work that well. You get some high-low in the morning, but then it's just low by about 10. But anyways, I think Tina Brown's going to make a run at trying high-low at Newsweek, and I hope it, she's very clever, and hope it will work. Yes, ma'am.
Are there any current steps that kind of journalists already working with
Yes, weird. This is going to sound a little surprising. The New York Times. You read the front page of the New York Times and say 1955, 1975, 1985, and then you read it today. Huge difference. You didn't necessarily notice it because it still looked kind of gray and respectable and all that, although it has color pictures. But they've utterly changed the writing style. It's fun to read. The New York Times is fun to read now. It's lively, it's well edited, it's well read. My old parent company, the Washington Post Company, lost the race because the Washington Post remained dull to read, badly edited and dull. And it lost its best writers to the New York Times. And unfortunately, I'm sad about this, but the Post has kind of faded, and the New York Times has some big financial problems they're still struggling with because they made some bad business decisions on real estate and other things. So they're still in trouble. But I think they've actually found, at least for the high end, a pretty good formula that is pretty high-low. I think you get, I read the New York Times on Sunday, and for a couple hours I have fun. I enjoy it. And so that's a working model. I wish there was more of that. It's harder than it looks. It takes really good editing to do that. The New York Times has on its front page a separate editor for every story, which is a luxury that most newspapers just don't have, and they rewrite everything. It's entirely an editor-written paper, and it's, it shows.
What are your thoughts about journalism in Wall Street?
Well, it's complicated. I mean, it's Murdoch bought it, and that could be dangerous. But Murdoch wants to die not just as a guy who created Roger Ailes, but as something larger and better than that. He mostly wants to beat the New York Times. Now, that particular thing I don't like because I want there to be a New York Times, and I think it would be a Pyrrhic thing for Murdoch to take down the New York Times out of some weird peak. So that part I don't like. But I would say the Journal he's turning it into a general interest newspaper. It's a pretty good general interest newspaper. It really is. I don't think it's as good as the New York Times, but it's good. And it's sort of replaced the Washington Post as the other paper. And so I have mixed feelings about it. I'm always suspicious of Murdoch, but I think he wants on his tombstone that he was a responsible guy at the end and wants to produce a responsible paper. And the staff, there are awful lot of good people there. And so, I want to hope for the best. Yeah.
What do you think of the change in
Well, that was always misleading. I worked there for 33 years, so I can speak from experience. We were always a hybrid. We were always a blend of news and opinion. Now, it was done in this, as I said earlier, this kind of Olympian tone. And there was a lot of news in it, and there was a lot of reporting. But we were telling readers what to think. We really were, which is what the New York Times does today. But that's what we were always a funny kind of blend. Now, you can tilt that. What's happened in recent times is there's been less news because there's less reporting. Staff got smaller, and we just did less reporting. And so there's more opinion. So it feels kind of airier and more opinionated. But I just want to be clear here that we were never purely news. We were always a magazine of news and opinion. The balance has shifted somewhat. I think Tina Brown told me, I had lunch with her a couple of weeks ago, she likes reporting, but it's expensive. I mean, we had all these bureaus, and when I came to Newsweek, there were over 400 editorial employees. I think there are like 90 now. So we just don't have the same, because the advertising model busted. And car ads used to be, I think, 40% of our revenues, and 2 or 3 years ago, we had like one car ad. It's tough. We got to figure out something between the Daily Beast and, making us as an app on a tablet. That's the great hope, is that in a couple of years, we'll be an app on a tablet, and you can charge for content. There's all this stuff swirling around here that we can rescue ourselves. But it's a close thing. And Newsweek's gotten thinner in many ways, no doubt about it. Yeah.
What do you think of the reaction to the new reporters
Oh, yeah, Juan Williams and all that. I haven't really thought about it. I think they should, my knee-jerk thing is they should leave Juan Williams alone and let him say whatever he wants. I think it's sort of, I remember when I looked at it, I didn't care that much because I thought it was going to be a tempest in a teapot, the kind of thing that people get all excited about, but doesn't really mean that much. But I haven't really thought about it. Sure.
How did we get to, in what part of the press I think this terrific animosity, which is worse than ever? Yeah, 50, I think, for example, 50 Democrats, 50 Republicans, all 50 Democrats liberalized, and all 50 Republicans liberalized, and nothing gets done. How did we arrive at that stage with this question?
Yeah.
Writing a letter to Paul?
Well, no, I agree. It's, Norm Ornstein, who's a political scientist, once had a useful image. Think of a football field, and when in Congress standing at the football field, and somebody says, "Okay, go out and stand on your appropriate yard line." Well, 20 or 30 years ago, a lot of people at the 40-yard line. A lot of people in the midfield. Now they're all down to the 5. They're all on one end zone or the other. So it really did change. What happened? A lot of things. One was gerrymandering, redistricting. State legislators creating safe seats sort of fed the extremists as they gerrymandered things. They want to have safe seats, and that it fed the people who are more partisan and extreme in their views. The activists sort of got control of it, and so they created congressional districts that tended to elect people who were not middle of the road, but more partisan. That was one thing that happened. Newt Gingrich gave a good name to vituperation when he came in 1994. Sort of, he would say, don't be like those don't be like Bob Michael, the old Republican leader. He was a nice, intelligent golf-playing guy. He used to go out and play golf with the Democrats. Bad idea. Be angry, attack. They perverted C-SPAN, of all things. Sweet old C-SPAN, which is supposed to be this wonderful, let the sunlight into the house. Well, it became it had a terrible impact. One is all these congressmen would get their morning minute televised, which they loved, so they would get hotter and more angry and wag their fingers, and it kind of torqued up things. And voters would watch that and either be inspired by, the activists would be inspired by it, and everybody else would go, who is that person yelling at me? Ugh. It turned people off to politics, because congressmen don't really look that good when they're shouting into a microphone or into a camera. And so the effect of C-SPAN and Newt Gingrich actually hurt. Talk about the laws of unintended consequences. You would think bringing cameras into the House is a democratic thing to do, and more information and more free speech and public be informed and all that. No, it created more shouting, more finger pointing, turned off a lot of voters from politics altogether, inflamed others. I mean, back to what I was saying, in the world of rational men, good idea to have cameras in there. In the world of emotional men and women, bad idea to have cameras in there, because it made things actually worse. And it has gotten worse, there's just no question. Now, there are complicated currents here. Party identification is at an historic low. It's not like everybody's become a Republican or a Democrat hating each other. On the extremes, it's hot and angry, but there's a vast number of people who are independent. Really what happened last couple of weeks ago is not that everybody became Republicans, it's just that independents who had broken for Obama in 2008 broke for the Republicans in 2010. Not that they became Republicans, they just, because they were angry and frustrated, voted for Republicans. So it's not that the Republican Party is coming on so strong. There are an awful lot of people in the middle who are up for grabs, I think, still. Those are the people I think that Obama could get by being honest, those independents and those people who are kind of disaffected. Marcus Pryor, who's a professor here at the Woodrow Wilson School, did some fascinating research on how things have changed. That goes to your point. In 1971, I think it was, at 6:30 in the evening, in American households, I think it was 85 or 95% of all TV sets are tuned to 3 shows: NBC, CBS, ABC, Huntley, Brinkley, Cronkite. And everybody's getting a pretty middle-of-the-road dose of reasonably responsible politics. I mean, like the whole country is. Flash forward to today, and it's something like 9% of the TV sets. And the average age of the viewers is in the late 60s. And so it's, the older folks are still watching those shows, but younger people have tuned off altogether. So where did they go? Where did all those people go? Well, Marcus Pryor looked at it. Some of them become more politicized, get more news, more information. This is a tiny minority, maybe 10%. But they tend to get partisan information. They go to the blogs, they go to Rush Limbaugh, they're charged up, they're activists, and they're partisan. So the politically engaged people are getting more information, but it's more partisan information. And they're in the game. Then there's this vast middle group. What are they doing? They're watching ESPN, pornography, nothing at all. They're just not engaged. They're just tuned out. I think we're about done. Yep. Thank you very much.